I remember the sound my heels made against the marble floor of the Massachusetts courthouse that morning. Each step echoed with a finality I had been preparing for my entire life, though I did not know it until that moment. The weight of my briefcase felt different somehow, heavier with purpose, lighter with truth. I was 32 years old, a criminal prosecutor with a reputation for being relentless, and I was walking into a courtroom where I would sit not at the prosecution table, but at the defense. The irony was not lost on me. Serafina Vance sat in the plaintiff's row, her designer coat draped perfectly over her shoulders, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood the power of appearance. Beside her, Sterling Vance adjusted his cufflinks, the same nervous gesture I had observed through windows and across parking lots throughout my childhood. They looked older than I remembered, but then again, I had not seen them in over 4 years. Not since I hung up on my mother's screaming voice and decided I was done being their ghost child, the daughter who existed only when convenient, only when needed, only when there was something to extract. They did not look at me as I entered. Or perhaps they did not recognize me. I had been 3 months old when they left me with my grandparents. I had been 18 when I stopped waiting for them to come back. I was 32 now, and I was a stranger wearing their daughter's face. Judge Gideon Thorne sat at the bench, reviewing documents with the careful attention of a man who understood that justice was built on details. When he looked up and saw me, something shifted in his expression. Recognition, confusion. Then understanding crashed over his features like a wave breaking against rocks. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. He set his pen down with deliberate force. "These allegations are against you. You are the defendant." The confusion in the room was palpable. I could feel the rustle of papers, the whispered questions, the sudden attention focusing on the disconnect between expectation and reality. Serafina and Sterling turned to look at me then, their faces portraits of bewilderment. They looked at me as if I were a stranger, because to them, I was. Judge Thorne's gaze moved from me to my parents, and I saw something harden in his expression. "You do not know who your daughter is?" I met their stares with the calm I had learned in courtrooms, where emotion was weakness and control was power. Inside, something dark and sweet unfurled in my chest. They did not know. After 32 years, they had sued me without even knowing what I had become. The delicious irony of it made me want to laugh, but I had learned long ago how to keep my face neutral, how to let my actions speak louder than any expression ever could. I took my seat at the defendant's table, directly across from the two people whose DNA I shared, but whose lives had never intersected with mine in any meaningful way. The game had begun, and they had no idea they had already lost. Let me take you back to where this story truly begins, to a hospital in Boston 32 years ago, to the moment when biology intersected with abandonment and set the course for everything that would follow. Serafina was 18 when I was born, a beauty with hollow eyes and dreams too big to be contained by something as mundane as motherhood. Sterling was 20, a promising hockey player with a full scholarship and a future that sparkled like ice under arena lights. I have seen the photos from that time, found in a box in my grandmother's attic years later. My mother looked at the camera with the exhausted desperation of someone trapped, and my father looked at her with the devotion of someone who would follow her anywhere, even into the decision to abandon their child. They stood over my incubator for exactly 7 minutes. I know this because the nurse noted it in a file that would later be submitted as evidence. 7 minutes to look at the daughter they had created. 7 minutes to decide that their future mattered more than mine. 7 minutes before they walked away and left me in the hands of people who actually understood what love meant. "A baby," my mother whispered to my father, her voice recorded in my grandmother's journal. "It ruins everything." Sterling did not argue. He simply took her hand and led her away, back to their glittering future, their unencumbered dreams, their life that had no room for the inconvenience of a child. 3 months later, on a rain-soaked evening in Brooklyn, Eleanor and Elias Caldwell stood at their front door and received me like a precious gift wrapped in betrayal. My grandmother's hands trembled as she took me from Serafina's arms, and I would later learn that those trembles were rage, not age. "She will be here temporarily," Serafina said, her voice quick with practiced lies. "We just need to get stable." My grandfather, Judge Elias Caldwell, fixed Sterling with a stare that had made hardened criminals confess their sins. "How long is temporary?" Sterling did not answer. He pulled Serafina toward their car, through the rain that fell like judgment from a sky that understood what I was too young to comprehend. I was being left behind, not for days or weeks, but for a lifetime. Eleanor held me against her chest and wept. Her tears fell into my baby hair, and I like to think that even then, in some primal way, I understood the difference between the woman who gave birth to me and the woman who would raise me. Biology might create life, but presence creates family. My childhood was a patchwork of love and absence, of being cherished by the people who showed up and ignored by the people who should have. My grandfather would come home from the courthouse still wearing his judicial robes, and he would sweep me up in his arms and ask me about my day with the same serious attention he gave to testimony in his courtroom. I would tell him about the ants I found in the garden, about the way they worked together to carry crumbs bigger than themselves, and he would nod gravely and say, "Fascinating. Tell me more about their organizational structure." My grandmother taught me to bake, and we would spend Saturday mornings covered in flour, creating cookies that never turned out quite right but tasted perfect anyway. She would let me lick the spoon and tell me stories about my grandfather's early days as a lawyer, when he was so nervous before his first trial that he forgot his briefcase and had to borrow legal pads from opposing counsel. But there were other moments too, moments that stood in sharp contrast to the warmth of my grandparents' love. I remember standing alone at Brooklyn Field, watching other children's parents cheer from the sidelines during soccer games. My grandparents came to every single one, but I would still scan the crowd for faces I had only seen in photographs, hoping against logic that this would be the day they remembered they had a daughter. When Serafina and Sterling did visit, it was always brief, always rushed, always tinged with the unspoken message that they had somewhere better to be. My mother would stay on her phone, offering air kisses and vague promises while checking her watch. My father would wait in the car, honking the horn if she took too long, as if even those few minutes with me were more than he could spare. I remember one visit when I was 7. I had made a drawing for them, spending hours coloring it perfectly, writing "I love Mommy and Daddy" across the top in my careful child's handwriting. Serafina glanced at it, said, "That's nice, sweetie," and left it on the coffee table when she departed. I found it there 3 days later, exactly where she had placed it, untouched and unremarked upon. My grandmother found me crying in my room and held me while I sobbed into her cardigan that smelled like vanilla and safety. "Some people," she said softly, stroking my hair, "do not know how to love. It is not your fault. It is their limitation, not your worthlessness. But children do not understand such nuances. Children only understand absence and presence, and my parents were masters of absence. What I did not know then, what I would not discover until much later, was that my grandfather was sending my mother $3,000 every month. Bank statements that would eventually be entered as evidence showed a pattern of transfers that began when I was 6 months old and continued for over 20 years. More than $800,000 given freely to support his daughter and her husband, with the unspoken expectation that they would, at minimum, be parents to the child they had created. They took the money. They cashed every check, made every withdrawal, spent every dollar, but they could not be bothered to show up. There was an incident when I was 12 that illuminated the tension simmering beneath our family's surface. Sterling arrived 2 hours late to pick up Serafina from my grandparents' house, and I watched through my bedroom window as my grandfather, this dignified man who commanded respect in every courtroom in Massachusetts, grabbed Sterling by his collar and shoved him against the wall. "Will you make her proud?" My grandfather's voice was hoarse with fury and grief. "Or will you only disappoint her?" Sterling stammered something about working hard, about trying his best, about opportunities that were just around the corner. Empty words from an empty man, promises that dissolved like smoke in sunlight. My grandfather released him with disgust, and I saw something in his face that I would not understand until years later. It was not just anger, it was heartbreak. The heartbreak of a father watching his daughter choose a weak man over her own child. The heartbreak of knowing that money could not buy what love should provide freely. The monthly payments continued, but the visits became less frequent, then rare, then almost non-existent. By the time I was 13, I saw my parents perhaps 3 times a year, always briefly, always with the same hollow promises of, "We will do better, and things will change soon." They never did. I learned to stop hoping. I learned to fill the parent-shaped holes in my heart with the solid, steady presence of my grandparents. And I learned something else too, something that would shape the course of my entire life. I learned that actions mattered more than words, that presence mattered more than promises, and that the people who showed up were the only ones who earned the title of family. When I was 18, I was in my sophomore year at Boston University, studying pre-law because my grandfather had shown me that justice was not just an abstract concept but a tangible force that could protect the vulnerable and punish the cruel. I was in the library, studying for my constitutional law midterm, when my phone rang. The number was my grandparents' home, but the voice was my grandfather's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, and she was crying. "Anya," she said, her voice breaking, "you need to come home. It's your grandmother." I do not remember the drive home. I know that it was raining, that my windshield wipers could not keep up with the downpour, that I was crying so hard I could barely see the road. I know that I arrived to find ambulances and police cars and neighbors standing in clusters on the sidewalk, their faces painted with sympathy and sorrow. Eleanor Caldwell had died of a massive stroke while gardening, her hands still dirty with soil, a bag of tulip bulbs lying beside her. She had gone quickly, they told me, without pain, but that knowledge did nothing to fill the crater her absence created in my chest. I found my grandfather in the backyard, sitting in the rain beside the unplanted bulbs, his judicial robes soaked through, his face a mask of devastation that transcended words. I sat beside him, and we stayed there until dawn, not speaking, just existing in our shared grief, watching the rain wash away the world we had known. The funeral was held 3 days later. Serafina and Sterling attended, dressed appropriately, saying appropriate things, performing appropriate grief for the cameras and the community. But they left immediately after the service, before the reception, before the burial, before they would have had to actually engage with me in any meaningful way. I stood in the cemetery and watched their car disappear down the winding road, and something inside me crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. I had spent 18 years making excuses for them, believing that somehow, someday, they would become the parents I needed. But standing there beside my grandmother's grave, with my grandfather's hand trembling in mine, I finally understood the truth. They had made their choice. Now I would make mine. Enough, I whispered to the wind, and the tombstone and the God I was not sure I believed in. Enough. The years that followed were a study in focused determination. My grandfather and I became a unit of two, bound by grief and love, and the shared understanding that we were all each other had. We cooked meals together, watched old movies, spent evenings in his study, where he taught me the intricacies of legal precedent and the art of constructing an unassailable argument. Justice, Anya, he would say, his voice rough with age and wisdom, is not just about law, it is about truth, and truth always needs someone brave enough to speak it. He taught me to read case law, to spot logical fallacies, to build arguments from evidence rather than emotion. He taught me that the courtroom was not just a place of judgment but a theater where truth and lies battled for supremacy, and the winner was determined by preparation, skill, and unwavering commitment to facts. I graduated summa cum laude from Boston University, first in my class. My grandfather sat in the front row, recording every moment on a camera he barely knew how to operate, his face shining with pride that neither of my parents had ever shown. Serafina and Sterling did not attend. They sent a card. It arrived 2 weeks late. I went to law school at Harvard, driven by something deeper than ambition. I wanted to be like my grandfather, to be someone who stood between the vulnerable and the powerful, someone who used the law as a shield and a sword. I studied until my eyes burned, worked until my hands cramped, pushed myself beyond every reasonable limit because I had something to prove, not to my parents, but to myself. I became a criminal prosecutor because I understood what it meant to be abandoned, to be used, to be treated as less than human. I understood the rage and helplessness of victims, and I channeled that understanding into a career where I gave voice to the voiceless and brought consequences to those who thought they were above the law. My grandfather attended every major trial I prosecuted. He would sit in the gallery, still and attentive, and afterward he would take me to dinner and we would dissect my performance with the precision of surgeons, identifying strengths and weaknesses, celebrating victories and learning from defeats. I never dated seriously. I had no time and even less interest. Men would ask me out, and I would decline politely, my focus consumed by work and by the man who had been father, grandfather, mentor, and best friend, all rolled into one complicated, brilliant, loving package. When I was 28, my phone rang with a number I had not seen in years. Serafina's voice was sharp with entitlement and anger, demanding that I help Sterling with some legal trouble, some accusation of fraud that I never got the full details of because I refused to listen past her opening salvo. "You have to help your father," she said, her voice rising with each word. "It is your duty as his daughter." Something cold and final settled in my chest. Duty? My voice was ice over steel. What duty? What have you ever done for me that would create an obligation? You left me when I was 3 months old. You took money from your father for 2 decades and could not be bothered to show up for a single school play, a single birthday, a single moment that mattered. I am a criminal prosecutor, not a defense attorney for fraudsters, and even if I were, I would never help him. I hung up while she was still screaming. I blocked both their numbers. I was done. 4 years later, when I was 32 and had just successfully prosecuted the largest embezzlement case in Massachusetts history, I came home to find my grandfather asleep in his chair, the newspaper still in his lap, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked peaceful, restful, content in a way that made me smile as I draped a blanket over him. He never woke up. The doctor said it was his heart, that he had gone peacefully in his sleep, that at 89 he had lived a full and meaningful life. They said all the things people say when death is expected and gentle, but their words did nothing to address the howling emptiness their truth created. I did not cry the way I had when my grandmother died. I had learned by then that some griefs are too profound for tears, that some losses create chasms too deep for any expression of sorrow to fill. Instead, I sat beside him and held his hand, still warm, and I whispered, "You taught me everything. I will not let you down." The will reading occurred 2 weeks after the funeral, in the mahogany-paneled office of Clarence Whitmore, my grandfather's longtime attorney and friend. I sat across from Clarence's desk, expecting perhaps a small inheritance, maybe the house in Brooklyn that held so many memories, perhaps some keepsakes and family heirlooms. What I received instead was everything. "Your grandfather left his entire estate to you," Clarence said. his voice formal but his eyes warm with understanding. The house in Brooklyn, valued at $1.2 million. His investment portfolio, worth approximately $1.8 million. His pension and life insurance, totaling another $1 million. Everything, Anya, $3 million in change. I stared at him, unable to process the information. Everything? But what about Serafina? Clarence's expression shifted into something grim and knowing. Judge Caldwell was very specific. He left nothing to his daughter. In fact, he anticipated that she might contest the will, so he prepared extensively. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside was a sealed letter addressed to me in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, and beneath it, a stack of documents that would later become exhibits in a trial I did not yet know was coming. Bank statements showing 23 years of monthly transfers, totaling $847,000. Email printouts where Serafina asked for money while promising to visit more often, promises that were never kept. Text message transcripts where she canceled plans at the last minute, always with flimsy excuses, always with requests for additional funds. He documented everything, Clarence said softly. Every broken promise, every missed occasion, every time he sent money and received nothing but empty words in return. He knew she would come after you when he died, Anya. He wanted you to have the weapons to fight back. I opened the letter with shaking hands. My grandfather's words were precise and loving, the prose of a man who had spent his life crafting arguments and now applied that skill to one final message. My dearest Anya, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are facing a battle I wish I could fight for you. But I taught you well, and I know you will prevail. Your mother will contest this will. She will claim I was manipulated, that I was not of sound mind, that you stole from her what she believes is rightfully hers. Do not let her deceive you. She made her choices long ago, and actions have consequences. You earned every penny through 32 years of love, presence, and devotion. She earned nothing but the consequences of her absence. Stand firm, fight hard, make me proud. You already have, but do it once more, for posterity. With all my love, now and always, grandfather. I folded the letter carefully and looked at Clarence. When will she sue? She already has, he replied. The papers were filed this morning. Of course they were. My parents had not attended the funeral. They had not called to offer condolences. But they had hired a lawyer and initiated legal action before my grandfather's body was even cold in the ground. The clarity of their priorities was almost refreshing in its absolute shamelessness. 3 weeks later, I stood in my apartment and listened to my lawyer, Patricia Moss, explain the particulars of the lawsuit. Serafina and Sterling were claiming that I had unduly influenced my grandfather, that I had isolated him from his daughter, that I had manipulated a sick old man into disinheriting his child. It's going to be ugly, Patricia warned. They will try to paint you as a gold digger who preyed on an elderly man's vulnerability. I laughed, the sound sharp and brittle in the quiet of my living room. They think I am still that little girl waiting for them to come back. They have no idea what I have become. Patricia smiled, the expression of a shark who had just scented blood in the water. Then let us show them. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in October, with Judge Gideon Thorne presiding. I watched his face carefully as he reviewed the case file, saw the moment he recognized my name, saw the shock that followed when he realized I was the defendant, not the plaintiff. Judge Thorne had been my grandfather's law clerk 30 years ago, had learned the craft of justice at the feet of a master. The conflict of interest was obvious and significant, and when he asked if either party objected to him hearing the case, my lawyer and I exchanged glances. No objection, Patricia said smoothly. Malcolm Croft, my parents' attorney, hesitated. I could see him weighing options, considering angles, trying to decide if having a judge who knew my grandfather personally would help or hinder their case. Finally, after whispering with Serafina and Sterling, he announced, "No objection, Your Honor." It was a mistake. They did not realize it yet, but it was a fatal mistake. Judge Thorne knew my grandfather's character, knew his values, and would see through any lies or manipulations my parents attempted. They had just handed me an advantage, and they were too foolish to recognize it. Croft's opening statement was a masterpiece of manipulation and false narrative. He painted Serafina as a devoted daughter who had been tragically separated from her father by malicious interference. He described my grandfather as a vulnerable old man, isolated and confused, controlled by a granddaughter who had her eyes on his fortune from the beginning. "This is a case about elder abuse," Croft said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "About a young woman who saw an opportunity and exploited it ruthlessly. Serafina Vance loved her father desperately, but was kept from him by someone who wanted to ensure the inheritance went exactly where she wanted it to go." I kept my face neutral, my hands folded calmly on the table in front of me, but inside I was cataloging every lie, every misrepresentation, every distortion of truth that would soon be systematically dismantled. Patricia's opening statement was surgical in its precision. "Your Honor, this case is very simple. Judge Elias Caldwell was a brilliant, careful, deliberate man who lived his life according to principles of justice and truth. He left his estate to the person who earned it through 32 years of consistent love and unwavering presence. The plaintiffs had every opportunity to be in his life. They chose not to take it. Now they want to profit from his death in a way they never bothered to engage with his life. The evidence will show a pattern of absence, of broken promises, and of financial support given freely but never reciprocated with actual relationship. The battle lines were drawn. Now came the war. Serafina took the stand dressed in conservative navy, her makeup subtle, her demeanor that of a grieving daughter who had been wronged. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, as Croft led her through a narrative of love and loss, of a father she adored and a daughter who stole him away. "He was everything to me," she said, her voice catching in what I am sure was rehearsed emotion. "I trusted him with Anya, thinking it would be temporary, but they turned her against me. By the time she was grown, she had poisoned him against his own daughter. It was a compelling performance, I had to admit. If I had not lived the truth, I might have believed her." Then Patricia stood for cross-examination, and the facade began to crack. "Miss Vance, you voluntarily placed Anya with your parents when she was 3 months old, correct?" "Yes, but it was supposed to be temporary." "How long is temporary? A month? A year? 32 years? Serafina's jaw tightened. "We had financial difficulties." "Financial difficulties," Patricia repeated, then turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce Exhibit A, Judge Caldwell's personal journal, specifically the pages documenting Miss Vance's visits during Anya's first year of life." The journal appeared on the large screen positioned for the court to see. My grandfather's careful handwriting documented each visit, complete with dates, times, and duration. Serafina had visited me 7 times in my first year of life. The longest visit lasted 45 minutes. The shortest was 12 minutes. 7 visits, Patricia said softly, in 12 months. An average of 23 minutes per visit. Does that sound like a mother desperately trying to be with her child? Serafina's composure slipped. I was young. I was struggling. "Let us talk about that struggle," Patricia said, her voice sharpening. "Your father sent you $3,000 per month for over 20 years, correct? That is $36,000 per year, more than $800,000 total." The bank statements appeared on screen, an overwhelming cascade of evidence that contradicted every word of Serafina's testimony. "I did not know the exact amount," Serafina stammered. "You cashed every check. You made every withdrawal. You knew exactly how much he was sending. And during those 20 years, how often did you visit him? How often did you call? How often did you make any effort to have a relationship with the man who was financially supporting you?" Serafina's lawyer objected, but Judge Thorne overruled him. "The witness will answer." "I visited when I could," Serafina said, her voice rising with defensiveness. "Let me be more specific," Patricia said, pulling up more documents. "These are emails from you to your father. Let me read a few excerpts. Dad, I really need the money this month. Things are tight. I promise I will come visit soon." That was sent in March of 2015. You did not visit until November. Here is another. "Can you increase the monthly amount? I will bring Anya to see you this summer." You never brought her. Shall I continue? The emails kept coming, a damning pattern of promises made and broken, of money requested and received, of visits canceled and rescheduled, and ultimately never occurring. "Miss Vance," Patricia said, her voice cold with controlled fury. "Is it true that you stopped visiting your father entirely after he retired and could no longer provide the extra money beyond the monthly $3,000? "That is not," Serafina began, but Patricia cut her off. "Judge Caldwell retired in 2019. His bank records show the last additional payment to you was in December of that year. When was your last visit to him?" Silence. "Miss Vance, when was your last visit to your father before he died in 2025? "I don't remember the exact date. Let me help you. It was Christmas 2019. You stayed for less than an hour. In the 6 years before his death, you did not visit him once. Not once. But you did text him asking for money 4 times. He declined. How did that make you feel?" Serafina lost control then, her careful facade shattering. "He did not understand. He never understood what I was going through." "What you were going through," Patricia repeated. "Tell me, what was Anya going through when you abandoned her? What was she going through at every birthday party, every school play, every graduation you missed? What was your father going through, raising your child while you cashed his checks and disappeared?" "Objection!" Croft shouted. "Argumentative!" "Sustained," Judge Thorne said, but his face was granite, and I saw the judgment in his eyes. The damage was done. Serafina left the stand shaking, her careful costume of the wronged daughter in tatters. Sterling's testimony was even worse. He took the stand confident and charming, the former athlete who still carried himself like someone important. But under Patricia's questioning, he crumbled. "Mr. Vance, you are Anya's biological father, correct?" "Yes." "Can you name 3 significant events in her life that you attended?" Sterling's face went blank. he stammered, searching for answers that did not exist. "Let me help you," Patricia said, pulling up photographs on the screen. "This is Anya's high school graduation. See these people in the front row? That is Judge and Eleanor Caldwell. Where were you, Mr. Vance?" "I had work." "You were unemployed at the time, according to tax records. This is Anya's college graduation. Where were you?" "I think I had a conflict." "You were in Atlantic City, according to credit card records. This is Anya's law school graduation. Where were you?" Sterling said nothing. "You were not there, Mr. Vance. You were never there. And now you want half of the estate left by the man who was actually present, the man who actually raised your daughter while you cashed his checks and lived your life as if she did not exist." Sterling's lawyer tried to object, tried to redirect, but the truth was undeniable. The photographs told a story that no amount of legal maneuvering could rewrite. Finally, it was my turn to testify. I walked to the stand with the same calm confidence I brought to every courtroom, but this time I was not prosecuting a case. I was defending my truth, my life, my right to the love and inheritance I had earned through 32 years of showing up. Patricia led me through my childhood, through the memories of grandparents who loved me and parents who did not. I kept my voice steady, my facts precise, my emotions controlled. This was not about making people feel sorry for me. This was about presenting evidence that spoke for itself. Then Croft stood for cross-examination, and I saw the predatory gleam in his eyes. He thought he could break me, rattle me, make me angry or defensive. He did not understand that I had spent years in courtrooms facing down criminals and liars. He was just another opposing counsel with a bad case and worse strategy. "Miss Petrova," he began, his voice oily with false concern. "Is it not true that you manipulated your grandfather, that you used his affection to secure your financial future?" I looked directly at him, then slowly turned my gaze to Serafina and Sterling. "Mr. Croft, I spent my entire life loving my grandfather. If my motive was inheritance, I wasted an enormous amount of time. I could have built my own career and my own wealth instead of having dinner with an old man every Sunday. But I chose him because he was worth more than any amount of money. That is something your clients will never understand." Croft tried to interrupt, but I was not finished. "My grandfather taught me that family is not about biology. It is about showing up. It is about being present for the moments that matter and the moments that do not. It is about loving someone when it is convenient and when it is not. I earned my inheritance through 32 years of love. Your clients earned nothing but the consequences of their absence." The courtroom was silent. I could see tears in some jurors' eyes, anger in others. Serafina and Sterling looked like they wanted to object, to shout, to defend themselves, but they had no defense against the truth. When closing arguments finished, Judge Thorne called for a brief recess before delivering his verdict. He returned 20 minutes later, his face set in the expression of a man who had made a decision and would not be swayed. "I have reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades on the bench. "I have considered the testimony of all parties, and I must say, this is one of the clearest cases I have ever heard." He looked directly at Serafina and Sterling. Judge Elias Caldwell was a man of exceptional intelligence, integrity, and judgment. I had the honor of serving as his law clerk early in my career, and I can say without hesitation that he was one of the finest legal minds in Massachusetts history. The will he created reflects his true intentions, carefully considered and deliberately executed. Judge Thorne's voice grew harder. "The evidence shows a pattern of absence by the plaintiffs that spans decades. It shows financial support provided consistently by Judge Caldwell, with no reciprocal relationship offered by his daughter. It shows a young woman raised by her grandparents who gave her everything while her biological parents gave her nothing but disappointment." He turned to me. "Miss Petrova, you earned this inheritance through 3 decades of love, presence, and devotion. The will stands as written. There is no undue influence, no diminished capacity, no legal basis for the plaintiff's claims." Then he turned back to my parents, and his expression was ice. "Furthermore, I am ordering the plaintiffs to pay Miss Petrova's legal fees in full. This lawsuit was filed without merit, motivated by greed rather than love, by entitlement rather than relationship. It was, quite simply, an abuse of the legal system." He raised his gavel. "The verdict is final." The sound of the gavel hitting the bench echoed through the courtroom like thunder, like justice, like 32 years of truth finally being heard and acknowledged and vindicated. Serafina and Sterling sat frozen, their faces white with shock and fury. They had come into this courtroom believing they would win, believing that biology would triumph over presence, that their legal right as daughter and son-in-law would override the reality of their absence. They had been wrong. As people began to leave the courtroom, Serafina ran toward me, her composure completely shattered. Tears streamed down her face, her makeup running in dark rivulets, her hands reaching out as if to grab me, to hold me, to force me into some version of the mother-daughter relationship she had never bothered to create when it actually mattered. "Anya," she sobbed, her voice breaking with what I assumed was manufactured grief. My daughter, please. We need to talk. Please. You have to understand. I stopped and turned to face her fully. This woman who had given birth to me but had never been my mother. This woman who had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from my grandfather but could not spare an hour to attend my school plays. This woman who now cried because she had lost money, not because she had lost me, because she had never had me to begin with. There is nothing to say, Serafina. She flinched at the use of her first name, as if only now realizing that she had forfeited the title of mother through decades of absence. I am your mother, she said, her voice rising with desperation and anger. You cannot treat me like this. I gave birth to you. I am your mother. I looked at her for a long moment, studying her face for any sign of genuine emotion beyond self-interest. I found none. No, I said quietly, but with absolute finality. You are the woman who gave birth to me. My mother was Eleanor Caldwell. She was the one who held me when I cried, who taught me to bake cookies, who sat with me through every cold and scraped knee and broken heart. She earned the title of mother through 32 years of presence. You had the same opportunity. You chose not to take it. But Serafina began, her tears now mixed with rage, her face contorting into something ugly and desperate. You had 32 years, I continued, my voice cutting through her protests like a blade. 32 years to show up, to be present, to be a parent in any meaningful way. You chose yourself every single time. You chose your career, your husband, your convenience. You made your choice. Now live with the consequences. Sterling appeared beside her, his face red with anger. You ungrateful little bitch, he snarled, all pretense of civility gone. After everything we did for you. I laughed then, a sound without humor. Everything you did for me? You abandoned me at 3 months old. You visited 7 times in my first year. You missed every birthday, every graduation, every single moment that defined my life. The only thing you ever did for me was leave me with people who actually knew how to love. I stepped closer to them, close enough that they could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. Do not contact me again. Not for money, not for sympathy, not for anything. We are done. We have always been done, but now it is official. Go live whatever life you have built on my grandfather's money and your own selfishness, but do it without me. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking on the marble floor with the same definitive sound they had made when I entered. Behind me, I could hear Serafina's sobbing, Sterling's cursing, but I did not look back. There was nothing behind me worth seeing. Patricia met me at the courthouse steps, her face glowing with victory. That was magnificent, she said. Absolutely magnificent. It was truth, I replied. Truth does not require magnificence. It only requires courage. The next 3 years were a study in deliberate transformation. I threw myself into my work with renewed purpose, prosecuting cases with the same fierce dedication I had always brought to the courtroom, but now with an added dimension. I understood on a visceral level what it meant to be abandoned, to be used, to have people take from you without giving anything back. That understanding made me a better prosecutor, more empathetic to victims, more relentless in pursuing those who exploited the vulnerable. At 35, I was appointed as a judge, the youngest in Massachusetts history. The day of my swearing in, I wore my grandfather's judicial robes, the black fabric still carrying the faint scent of his cologne in his courtroom. I stood before the assembled crowd and took the oath with my hand on the same Bible he had used, feeling his presence like a physical weight, a blessing, a continuation of a legacy built on justice and truth. My first case as a judge involved a custody dispute. A mother who had abandoned her children for 5 years suddenly reappeared, demanding custody when she learned that their father, who had raised them alone, had won the lottery. The parallels to my own life were impossible to ignore. I listened to her testimony about how much she loved her children, how circumstances had forced her absence, how she deserved a second chance. Then I listened to the children, who spoke with heartbreaking clarity about the father who had been there every day, who had helped with homework and coached soccer and held them when they cried. My ruling was swift and unambiguous. Parenthood is not a right to be claimed when convenient or profitable. It is a privilege earned through consistent presence and unwavering love. The children will remain with their father. The plaintiff's petition is denied. The mother's lawyer filed an appeal. It was rejected. My ruling stood, and I knew that somewhere, my grandfather was proud. At 38, I was nominated to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, the highest court in the state. The confirmation hearings were intense, with senators questioning my judicial philosophy, my views on constitutional interpretation, my fitness to serve. I answered every question with the precision and integrity my grandfather had taught me, and when the final vote came through, I had been confirmed unanimously. I sat in the same seat my grandfather had occupied 40 years earlier, looking out at a courtroom that felt both familiar and sacred. This was where he had dispensed justice for 3 decades, where he had built a reputation as a man who could not be bought, could not be swayed, could not be intimidated into compromising his principles. I wrote opinions on family law that became precedent throughout the state. I authored rulings that redefined what constituted a family, that recognized the reality that biology was insufficient without presence, that protected children from parents who wanted to claim them without earning them. One of my most significant rulings came in a case involving inheritance rights. An elderly woman had left her estate to her caretaker rather than her children, who had placed her in a nursing home and rarely visited. The children sued, claiming undue influence. I ruled in favor of the caretaker, writing in my opinion, family is not defined by blood but by action. The person who provides care, presence, and love has earned the mantle of family more than those who merely share genetic material. The will stands as written. The decision was controversial. It was also right, and it became case law that would influence inheritance disputes for generations. I learned through professional channels, not personal contact, that Serafina and Sterling's lives had not gone well after the trial. Sterling's business ventures failed one after another, each more catastrophic than the last. Serafina's health declined, though whether from stress or genetics or simple karma, I neither knew nor cared. They reached out several times over the years, through lawyers and mutual acquaintances, asking for reconciliation, asking for money, asking for something I had long ago stopped being able to provide. I ignored every overture. I had learned from my grandfather that some bridges, once burned, should stay ash. 20 years after my grandfather's death, the Massachusetts legal community decided to honor his legacy by renaming the Boston courthouse. It became the Elias Caldwell Justice Center, a fitting tribute to a man who had embodied everything the law should be. I stood at the dedication ceremony, now 52 years old, looking at the bronze plaque bearing his name and his likeness. The sculptor had captured something essential in my grandfather's face, the combination of sternness and compassion that had defined his approach to justice. I traced my fingers over the raised letters of his name and felt tears prick my eyes, the first I had shed since his funeral. "We did it, grandfather," I whispered. "Everything you hoped for." I learned of Serafina's death from a brief obituary in the Boston Globe when I was 55. She had died of complications from diabetes, alone in a hospital, with Sterling by her side. The obituary mentioned me as her daughter but did not note that I had not spoken to her in 23 years. I felt nothing when I read it. Not satisfaction, not grief, not even the bitter vindication I might have expected. Just a distant acknowledgement that a stranger who happened to share my DNA had died. Sterling passed 3 years later, also alone, also unmourned by me. Their funerals happened without my presence. Their graves were marked without my tears. Their deaths changed nothing in my life because their lives had meant nothing to me. Some people might call that cold. I called it consequence. They had chosen absence. I had honored that choice by making it permanent. At 60, after 30 years on the bench and a career that had fundamentally shaped Massachusetts family law, I announced my retirement. The legal community threw me a dinner, hundreds of lawyers and judges and officials gathering to celebrate a career of distinguished service. They talked about my opinions, my fairness, my unwavering commitment to justice. They talked about how I had changed the law to reflect the reality that family was about presence, not biology. What they did not know, what I never told anyone, was that every decision I made, every opinion I wrote, every ruling I delivered, was in some way a conversation with my grandfather. Everything I did was an attempt to honor the man who had chosen me, who had raised me, who had loved me enough to document every failure of my biological parents, so that when the inevitable battle came, I would have the weapons to win. On a crisp October morning, 40 years after my grandmother's death and 25 years after my grandfather's, I drove to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. I carried a bag of tulip bulbs, the same kind my grandmother had been planting when she died, and I knelt in the grass beside their graves. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of wind through the trees and the distant city noise that never quite faded in Boston. I dug small holes in the earth around their headstones, my hands getting dirty the same way my grandmother's had been, and I planted the bulbs with care. "I did everything you asked," I said softly, speaking to the granite markers that represented the only parents I had ever truly known. I stood up for myself. I fought for justice. I became someone you could be proud of. I sat back on my heels and looked at their names carved in stone. Eleanor Caldwell, beloved wife and grandmother. Elias Caldwell, distinguished jurist and devoted family man. Beneath their names was a quote my grandfather had chosen himself: "Justice is truth in action." "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for showing me what family really means." I stood and brushed the dirt from my hands, looking out at the cemetery spreading around me, at the hundreds of graves marking hundreds of lives, each with their own stories of love and loss and legacy. "Because that is the truth," I said, speaking to my grandparents, to the wind, to anyone who might be listening. "Family is not the people who share your DNA. Family is the people who show up, day after day, year after year, through the boring moments and the beautiful ones, through the easy times and the impossible ones." Blood might create a connection, but only actions create a family. I walked back to my car, leaving the tulip bulbs to take root in soil nourished by the bodies of the two people who had made me who I was. In the spring they would bloom, bright and beautiful, a living memorial to love that had been earned rather than assumed. I drove home through streets I had known my entire life, past the courthouse where I had spent decades, past the university where I had learned the law, past the house in Brooklyn that I still owned and could never bring myself to sell. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of the life I had built on the foundation my grandparents had provided. That evening, I sat in my study surrounded by legal texts and framed diplomas, and I opened my laptop to write something I had been thinking about for years. Not a legal opinion or a judicial ruling, but a personal essay about family, about love, about the difference between biology and presence. I titled it The Verdict of the Heart, and I wrote it not as a judge but as a granddaughter, as someone who had learned through painful experience that the law could provide justice but only love could provide healing. The essay would eventually be published in the Harvard Law Review, and it would spark a national conversation about family law, about inheritance rights, about the legal and moral obligations between parents and children. But that night, I wrote it simply to honor the truth, the same way my grandfather had taught me. When I finished writing, I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet of my study, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded me for most of my life. I had spent 32 years being abandoned. I had spent the next 30 years proving that I did not need the people who had abandoned me. And now, at 60, I finally understood that the greatest victory was not the trial I had won or the career I had built, but the simple fact that I had learned to love myself the way my grandparents had loved me. Unconditionally, consistently, without reservation or requirement. That was the verdict that mattered most. Not the one delivered by Judge Thorne in a Massachusetts courtroom, but the one I had delivered to myself after 6 decades of learning what family truly meant. I looked at the photograph on my desk, the one of my grandparents and me at my law school graduation. We were smiling, the three of us, and in that frozen moment you could see everything that mattered. Love, pride, presence. The building blocks of family that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice. This is not just my story, I said softly to the photograph, to the memory, to the legacy. This is justice. And in the quiet of my study, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a battle well won, I finally felt the weight of 32 years of abandonment lift from my shoulders. I had earned my inheritance. I had honored my grandparents. I had chosen love over resentment, presence over absence, truth over comfortable lies. I had won not just in a courtroom, but in the only arena that truly mattered. The courtroom of my own heart, where the verdict was final and the justice was real, and the family I had chosen me back, completely and forever. That was enough. That was everything. That was justice.